If you caught the last episode of this series, you already know why onions make you cry and the 4 factors chefs use to stop it. Today we're closing out this trilogy on the science of everyday cooking with something you probably make several times a week without thinking twice about it: rice. And here's the first surprise. Most people wash it wrong. And that small mistake affects everything from the final texture of your dish to something far more relevant to your health. Chances are, the way you wash rice right now is exactly the way your parents taught you, a habit you picked up as a kid and never actually questioned. Today, we're going to take that habit apart completely. Welcome back to the Wonder Lab, the channel where we turn everyday cooking into a laboratory of curiosity. Let's start with the basics. Why do we wash rice in the first place? Every grain of rice is coated in a layer of loose surface starch left over from milling and polishing. That coating is an unavoidable byproduct of processing, as raw rice gets hulled, milled, and polished to turn brown rice into the white rice most of us eat. The grains rub against each other and against the machinery, shedding tiny starch particles that stick to the surface of every single grain. That starch is made mostly of 2 molecules, amylose and amylopectin, and the ratio between them is exactly what determines whether a given variety of rice cooks up fluffy or sticky. The second rice hits hot water during cooking, that surface starch gelatinizes almost instantly, creating a sticky texture and, sometimes, that cloudy foam you see on top of the cooking water. That's also why you'll sometimes see a thin white film form around the edge of the pot. That's surface starch gelatinizing on contact with heat. Washing rice before cooking removes most of that loose starch, giving you looser, more separate grains once it's done. Perfect for plain white rice, fried rice, or pilafs. Think about fried rice specifically. If the rice grains still have that sticky starch coating, the second they hit a hot pan, they clump together into dense little globs instead of separating into distinct, bouncy grains. That's exactly why professional kitchens almost always start with rice that was cooked ahead of time, cooled, and, crucially, washed before cooking in the first place. Washing is the first step in a chain that ends with that perfect, grain-by-grain fried rice texture. But here's the twist almost nobody knows. Not every rice dish wants that loose texture. For Italian risotto, Spanish paella, or rice pudding, the goal is exactly the opposite. You want that surface starch to create a creamy, velvety texture. Italian chefs making risotto actually stir the pot constantly during cooking for exactly this reason. The friction from stirring deliberately releases more of that surface starch, building the dish's signature creamy, almost custard-like consistency. Wash the rice before making risotto, and you're not simplifying the recipe. You're actively removing the single ingredient responsible for the dish's soul. That's why chefs making these dishes traditionally skip washing the rice entirely. Washing it would strip away the exact natural ingredient responsible for that creaminess. This surprises a lot of people, because we assume washing rice is always the right move, when really, it depends entirely on what you're making. If you've ever followed a paella recipe to the letter and still ended up with something that just wasn't creamy enough, there's a good chance you now know exactly why. Now let's talk about the most common mistake, and possibly the most important one, tied to something you probably didn't expect to hear about in a cooking video: arsenic. Rice, more than most other crops, has a unique ability to absorb inorganic arsenic that occurs naturally in soil and irrigation water, especially in certain growing regions and in specific varieties like brown rice, which keeps the outer layer of the grain where this element tends to concentrate most. A big part of the reason comes down to how rice is grown in the first place. Unlike wheat or corn, which are dryland crops, rice spends most of its growing cycle standing in flooded paddies, and that prolonged contact with water makes rice far more efficient than other staple crops at pulling arsenic out of the soil and irrigation water around it. Chronic exposure to elevated arsenic through diet has been studied by international health organizations. And while the levels found in rice from typical consumption generally fall within ranges considered safe, reducing unnecessary exposure is still a recommended practice, especially for young children, who eat proportionally more rice relative to their body weight. Products like infant rice cereal, in particular, have been a long-standing focus of research and regulatory attention for exactly this reason. Washing rice properly, with several changes of cold water until the water runs noticeably clearer, measurably reduces the amount of arsenic on the surface of the grain, according to studies published by universities specializing in food safety. This isn't marketing spin. It's a difference you can actually measure in a lab. The mistake almost everyone makes isn't skipping the wash, it's underwashing. Giving it one quick rinse and dumping it straight into the pot before the water even has a chance to clear up. What you actually want is to repeat the process 3 to 5 times, gently swirling the rice in circles with your hand and pouring off the cloudy water each time, watching it get visibly clearer with every round. And here comes mistake number 2, just as common, but far less known: washing rice with hot water instead of cold. Hot water starts gelatinizing that surface starch almost immediately. Instead of removing it, it glues it even more tightly to the grain, doing the exact opposite of what you were trying to achieve. A lot of people assume hot water cleans better, but temperature is actually the critical variable here, not how clean the water looks. On top of that, if you're using enriched rice, the kind industrially fortified with B vitamins and iron through an outer coating, washing it aggressively with hot water can strip away a large portion of those added nutrients. You'd basically be throwing away the extra nutritional value you paid a premium for at the store. In many regions, that fortified rice plays a real role in addressing widespread nutrient deficiencies, so losing it to the wrong washing technique is a genuinely meaningful loss, not just a minor inconvenience. So here's the correct technique, combining everything we just covered. Always use cold water. Move the rice gently in soft, circular motions instead of scrubbing it hard between your hands. Rubbing too aggressively can break the grains and release even more internal starch. Repeat the process 3 to 5 times until the water runs noticeably clearer. It doesn't need to be perfectly transparent. And if you're making risotto, paella, or rice pudding, skip this entire process, because in those dishes, starch is your ally, not your enemy. There's one more technical detail almost no cooking video mentions. Washing rice changes how much water you need to cook it. When you wash rice, the grains absorb some moisture during rinsing and start to swell slightly even before they hit the pot. So if you keep using the exact same water ratio you'd use for unwashed rice, you'll likely end up with rice that's too wet or slightly overcooked. Grains that look soft on the outside but still taste a little underdone at the core, which is exactly the kind of uneven texture that happens when the water ratio isn't adjusted to match. As a general rule, if you wash your rice properly, you can reduce your cooking water by roughly 10% compared to the original recipe, and let it rest covered, off the heat, for 5 minutes once it's done, so the residual steam finishes distributing moisture evenly through every grain. It's a step a lot of people skip because they're hungry and impatient, but those 5 minutes are often exactly what separates rice that's evenly cooked from rice that isn't. It's worth mentioning that washing rice through multiple changes of water isn't some modern food science invention. It's a practice passed down for generations across many cultures in Asia, long before any study on starch or arsenic ever existed. In many households, the rule passed down from parents to kids was always simple: keep washing until the water runs clear. That simple, intuitive rule turns out to line up almost perfectly with what modern lab research now recommends. In this case, science didn't invent the technique. It just showed up centuries later to explain why that traditional kitchen wisdom worked so well. And now, let's close the full circle on this series. We started by asking why your boiled eggs never peeled cleanly, and discovered the 5-star hotel secret wasn't a single trick, but the combination of egg age, steaming, and a controlled ice water shock. Then we moved to onions and learned that crying isn't bad luck. It's pure defensive plant chemistry, solved with cold temperature, a sharp knife, saving the root for last, and good ventilation. And today we closed with rice, understanding that whether or not to wash it depends entirely on the dish you're making, and that when washing does apply, cold water with multiple changes is the difference between rice that's light and healthy and rice that's sticky and stripped of nutrients. These 3 episodes come together around one central idea that sums up exactly what we do here at the Wonder Lab. Almost everything we consider common sense in the kitchen actually hides a precise scientific explanation. And understanding that science lets us cook better with the exact same effort we were already putting in. The kitchen was never just a place for repetitive chores. It's also a tiny science lab that happens to run every single day. If you're catching this without having seen the first 2 parts of the series, Go check them out. The first one, on the 5-star hotel secret behind perfectly peeled eggs. The second, on how to cut onions without crying. Together, they complete this trilogy exactly as it was designed from the start, with each episode filling in a piece of the same puzzle. Subscribe to the Wonder Lab so you don't miss the next series of kitchen experiments. Share this entire trilogy with someone who loves cooking as much as they love understanding why things actually work. And drop a like if you learned something new today. Then tell us in the comments which everyday food you want us to turn into the next big experiment on the channel. See you in the next one.